If you are in an energy deficit, you will not maximize your muscular gain. If you want to maximize hypertrophy, you're going to need to be in some sort of caloric surplus, probably somewhere between 300 to 500 calories.
So in this episode of Fueling Greatness, I was joined by Professor Brad Schoenfeld. He's published over 300 publications in the field of strength conditioning, sports science, but in particular, he is a renowned expert in muscle hypertrophy.
My focus on hypertrophy came from me being a skinny kid, 114 pounds, very skinny growing up, and basically bodybuilding changed my whole perspective on my self-esteem.
We talk about evidence-based practice, hormones, different training variables, all sorts of stuff.
When I first started training, I was a bro. I followed the bodybuilding magazines. I'll date myself, but they were still delivering them in the mail. But I then plateaued fairly readily, and that kind of set my journey in motion. So the closer you want to get to optimization of your genetic potential, the more important having a scientific approach becomes.
So, Brad, I am delighted to welcome you to Fueling Greatness to have a chat with me today. Lots of people know who you are. You're a prolific researcher, but you haven't just been a researcher this past 10, 15 years or so. You've been a practitioner. You've also authored various books. You're all over the place when it comes to conferences and podcasts. And now I get to have a good chat with you again. I say again because the last time we had a good chat for a podcast was about 10 years ago. And I met you, of course, at an ISSN conference a few years before that. So time is passing us by, Brad.
There it is.
Why don't you give us a little bit of an overview as to who you are and what you're currently up to, and then we'll go from there.
Yeah, I'll keep it brief, but I'm a researcher educator at Lehman College in the Bronx, New York. It's a city university. And my primary focus is researching applied aspects of muscle development. But I've done a lot with sports nutrition. We look at strength. Basically, there's a lot of sub areas that I'm interested in as well. But my primary focus has been on the applied aspects of hypertrophy, and I've certainly also delved into the mechanistic aspects as well. So it's been a long ride, and 300 publications later, plus.
Well, I was about to say, Brad, one just has to have a quick, it's not possible to have a quick look at your Google Scholar or ResearchGate because it takes quite some time to troll through all the different publications, which doesn't just include peer-reviewed work. Like one of my favorite publications of yours, which I'll hold up to the camera, is this one from about 10 years ago. You'll remember this one well. We've actually done a podcast about that about 10 years ago, about the mechanisms of muscle hypertrophy and their application to resistance training, which for me still remains a classic. And many other people obviously think so because you've got so many citations for that one paper. But I think most people have an appreciation for how much time and effort somebody like yourself is putting into all the work that you're doing. And that's an understatement, I guess. But what led you into this area in the first place? You haven't always been a researcher, as I indicated at the beginning. This is a massive pathway that you've gone down. And I'd just love to learn what's been your motivation for all this.
Yeah, I've had a very tortuous, windy road to where I'm at now. But I was a personal trainer for many years, and my focus on hypertrophy came from me being a skinny kid, 114 pounds. I don't know, don't ask me kilograms. But it was very light. And I was very skinny growing up, and basically bodybuilding changed my whole perspective on my self-esteem. And I started delving then, once I did not get the results I wanted, into the scientific aspects and wanted to help others. And that led to the desire to be an educator on it, which led to my going back and getting my master's and then my PhD and then becoming a researcher. So that's the short course into a very long and windy road.
A bit like I'd share some characteristics with you. I recently interviewed Alan Aragon, by the way, who's similar-ish in as far as has years of being a PT or a trainer working in the real world, so to speak, which has played a a very important role, I feel, in the types of research and publications that you've brought out, particularly where there's an obvious focus on having meaningful impact. And by that, I mean impact on coaches, trainers, and just the general public, where there's a vast amount of research that exists out there in the body of knowledge, so to speak, in this area, but not all of it is necessarily directly relevant or applicable. And we can get into that because we both share an interest in evidence-based practice. That's what my whole doctorate was on. You've been a big proponent of that and have influenced me on that as well. So thank you for that. But why specifically muscle hypertrophy? Like I know that you were doing your training, you were struggling possibly to gain muscle mass through your own sweat and pain that you had in the gym, but why take it that far? I mean, you could have just been an influencer back in the day, one of the early influencers. Not that you haven't been a massive influence, but you know what I mean. But taking that step from being a PT in the gym to being a researcher in the lab is a pretty broad jump.
Yeah, it occurred over the course of years where I started immersing myself in research, and I started realizing I was more interested in disseminating information and educating people on what is causing the growth rather than just say, all right, here's the way you do a lat pull down or a seated row or a squat. After a while, that didn't float my boat as much as trying to explain to my clients who I was training at the time as to why, hey, look, this is causing this type of response within the muscle. They didn't care. They just, I just want to get toned, or I want to, bulk up. And that led me to say, well, I have a higher order, at least a goal, higher order goal. I'm certainly not saying that's a higher order on any hierarchy. But for me, the higher order goal was to educate the masses, and certainly the trainers who in general did not understand. They were basically basing their training on bro science. And I will also say this. What I started to realize this is going back to the turn of the century, as to the science, there really was not good science. A lot of on hypertrophy, most of the strength and conditioning research was focused on strength and power training, and hypertrophy was kind of the bastard child, because, for sports, the vast majority of sports, they just care about producing strength and power. Hypertrophy was a somewhat necessary, I shouldn't say evil, but a necessary side effect of creating strength and power, because it's involved. There is a relationship between muscle growth and muscle strength. So it was not being examined really very directly in most cases. And much of the theory that we had was based on acute research, was based on like hypotheses like the hormone hypothesis about trying to jack up the acute hormonal response. So anyway, we didn't have these longitudinal studies that actually measured muscle growth. And I was like, well, why aren't these studies? And when I started doing my master's degree, I really immersed myself in this and talked to some of my teachers at the time. And I was like, why aren't there studies? And they're like, well, you should get into, research and carry these out. So certainly
you used an interesting phrase, Brad, which was there wasn't any good science. Now, I think I know what you mean by that, but I think it's worth sharing what you mean by that with the audience, because it's an important issue.
Yeah. So most of the research was looking at it was inferred from acute research or let's say things like muscle protein synthesis, the muscle protein synthetic response, or basically just theories that were established. But the way you ultimately see whether or try to study a topic is to directly research it on a longitudinal basis, where you measure changes over time. You have one group do one thing and you have another group do another thing. You manipulate a given variable, and then you try to keep all other variables constant to draw causality into a response. And there was just very few studies, or when I say very few, there was very limited amount of data that we had on really all the resistance training variables.
So when we talk about things like muscle in sports science, sports nutrition, we come at these things from different angles. As a nutritionist, I'm thinking about, what can I do to have this person change their diet, optimize their diet, or maybe even have strategies that will impact the adaptations to the training stimulus. But of course, there's the other side of this. There's the training stimulus itself. And that's an area that I really wanted to get into with you, particularly when we're talking about muscle hypertrophy. That's a term I'm going to have you define as well in a minute. But it's all very easy to think, oh, I'm just going to have lots of protein, or for those that feel that they need to take alternative paths down, taking steroids or various other things. There's a lack of appreciation of I guess what the muscle is as it relates to strength and power, but particularly its growth and development and the mechanisms that will result in getting bigger, faster, and stronger, given the machine itself is such an important part of that process, particularly with speed and power and those sorts of things. So just as a sort of a general overview, what is muscle hypertrophy, and why is that important to things like strength training, strength athletes, physique athletes, that sort of thing?
Yeah, so hypertrophy is the increase in size of a tissue. Hypertrophy is the increase in size of muscle tissue, skeletal muscle. And that can be expressed in different ways, either as muscle thickness, which is a unidimensional measure, cross-sectional area, which is a two-dimensional measurement or assessment, and muscle volume, which is a three-dimensional measure. So all of these can be valid measures of hypertrophy, of the growth of tissue. Why is it important? I mentioned it before, because from an athletic standpoint, there is a correlation, a direct correlation between the size of a muscle and its ability to produce force. And the ability to produce force, of course, is related to power production. But even outside of that, aesthetically, if you're a bodybuilder, which is a sport, or we can argue whether it's a sport, but many people consider it a sport. Certainly, I would say more people, as a former personal trainer, cared about increasing size, not because of the strength correlation, but because of the aesthetic aspect, because it has a powerful effect on aesthetics, me included, as a former bodybuilder. So it's not only relevant to sporting context. And by the way, I don't know, we probably don't want to take it this far, but muscle tissue in itself has various health-related benefits. So the size of a muscle also is related to its ability to store glycogen, which has effects on insulin resistance. Muscle is a secretory tissue, so it actually secretes various what are called myokines into the bloodstream that affect other tissues. And so there are health-related benefits simply by having larger muscles as well.
Yeah, no, that is an area that I find fascinating. In fact, recently I was talking to Professor Darren Kanda about creatine, of course, and we were talking about all those other angles that creatine may bestow some benefits, such as cognitive benefits, but also just generally the overall health and well-being impact that muscle has. And age-related muscle losses can be serious. I know that I've experienced that in my own family members that are no longer here. Once they started losing their physical capabilities, there was a pretty rapid decline in their ability to function and ultimately to maintain their health. Given athletes are humans, I think that talking about this stuff is important, whether it's preventing injuries or just ensuring nice long health spans. I mean, particularly for an athlete, it can be pretty limited, the time span of certain professional athletes. And some of that will link, of course, to the state and condition of their muscles. So we can maybe get into some of that. But I think one thing that comes to mind, since you talk about bodybuilders, and if we were to sort of compare and contrast them to, say, powerlifters, we're not necessarily looking at big muscles as strong muscles or powerful muscles compared to, say, specifically strength athletes. Is there something in what I've just said, and what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So there is a direct relationship between strength and hypertrophy, but it's not a pure linear relationship. And there's certainly other factors that are involved in strength and power production, specifically on the neural end. So while hypertrophy contributes to strength, there are other ways to maximize strength from a powerlifting standpoint. Lifting heavy, there's mental aspects, there's all sorts of other, when I say all sorts, multiple other effects that can be generated through things other than hypertrophy. So while hypertrophy is important, other factors certainly are very important as well.
So, Brad, I've already mentioned the word hypertrophy. Not everybody knows what that really means, but they've also heard other terms like hyperplasia. What does hypertrophy mean? How does that differentiate itself from hyperplasia?
Yeah, so there is actually some relationship there because hyperplasia, basically hypertrophy, and this is the generally accepted working theory at this point, involves either the addition of muscle hypertrophy is the addition of sarcomeres either in parallel or in series. So in parallel hypertrophy is basically adding sarcomeres like sardines in a can, so next to each other, whereas in series hypertrophy would be adding like links in a chain, where you're increasing the length of the sarcomeres, how many sarcomeres are sequentially added. Hyperplasia, on the other hand, is when the muscle cell splits off and makes an additional muscle cell. So you can actually increase the size of a muscle by hyperplasia. It's just kind of a different, I think sometimes the terms are intertwined and not fully recognized. That hyperplasia, to me, in my definition, would be an outgrowth of, or would be, when it's an outgrowth, it would be another way of increasing hypertrophy. But here's what I would say. There's been good evidence in animal models that hyperplasia is possible. Jose Antonio, who we both know, head of ISSN, his doctoral work, he had seminal doctoral work done in quails where they basically taped up the bird's wings and attached little weights to them over periods of time over the course of a month and had progressive effects on it. And he showed that there was substantial hyperplasia that took place over the course of this avian, the time that these birds were subjected to the loaded stretch. Now, that is not obviously ecologically valid for resistance training. So the question is, does it happen in humans? And the general consensus, based on the data we have, is not to any great extent, and probably very little, if at all. With the one caveat where it may have applicability is in steroid users, or not only steroids, but using pharmacological enhancement, other types as well, that would cause massive growth. So the Jose Antonio's and the authors of that study, their conclusion or their hypothesis was that the muscles can achieve a certain size on their own simply by adding sarcomeres in parallel. By the way, in parallel is the primary way that hypertrophy occurs. In series, I don't know how much you want to get into it, but it's questionable how much that actually contributes. But their theory is that you can increase the size of a muscle up to a certain point by adding sarcomeres in parallel. And once the the fiber reaches a certain point, it can no longer hypertrophy in a quote unquote safe manner where it's going to be structurally sound, and thus it splits off and becomes, has additional fibers that are produced. And that theory is consistent with steroid use, where if you were to have massive increase in the size of your fibers, that they would reach a critical threshold where they would not be structurally sound beyond that point and conceivably would undergo hyperplasia. That's still, again, it's not well established, but there's been some evidence that is the case.
What I love about talking to experts like yourself is it just reminds us that there's all this stuff that we think is a sort of a definitive concept and understanding of something. It's just black and white. We know how muscles work. We know how nutrition influences adaptations to training. But we're still only just learning, really, aren't we? I mean, do you think there's a huge amount more to learn in this regard, or are we we're nearly there, or what are your thoughts?
In certain areas, so in some areas we have some quite good evidence, but in many others, I'd say in most, we are scratching the surface. And so you brought up mechanisms, my paper, the mechanisms of muscle hypertrophy and their application to resistance training. That was actually my capstone project for my master's, which I started in 2008. It was published in 2010. And while that is still, it has over, I think, 1,500 citations, going on 2,000 by last check. There's a lot that has changed, but even then, we're still really scratching the surface to try there's a lot of people, or I shouldn't say a lot, but some people, particularly some influencers online, who have very definitive opinions about the mechanistic aspects as if they know. And we are so far away from really understanding the true mechanisms. Now, we're certainly further than where we were when I wrote that paper. And I actually collaborated on a more recent paper with Henning Wackerhage, a very prominent researcher from Germany, as well as Jua Holme and some other colleagues. And we did an update in 2019 on the stimuli of sensors to talk about where we've come and still showing how far we have to go. So, I mean, it's become more and more apparent. So certainly mechanical tension is a primary driver. But even within mechanical tension, there's passive tension and active tension, and they seem to have different mechanistic or different stimuli and sensors that can initiate those processes. Whereas, again, I don't know how deep you want to get into this, but you're on it from an active level. There's the filament Seebag-3 pathway, which can be activated, or it's theoretically one that has been pretty well delineated. And there is focal adhesion kinase is another sensor that has been identified, but we still don't know. There's should be, and there's certainly hypothetical other models. Whereas passive, from a passive perspective, Titan is thought to be a primary passive sensor. Nuclear flattening, where the nuclei flatten out during the stretch, during your lengthening actions. There's stretch-activated channels, which are sensors. So without boring everyone to tears with these different mechanistic pathways, hopefully it at least brings to light the vast complexities of these and the how little we actually really know. So we're still trying to piece all these things together. In my original paper, I speculated that metabolic stress and muscle damage may be involved. We still are, in my opinion, far away from understanding their applications. There's some research suggesting that there may be additive. So I think both of those certainly have credence with there are mechanisms that can be cited as to where they could promote growth, but as to whether they're additive to the mechanical tension, that I think certainly is far from clear. And we know that mechanical tension is by far and away the primary driver, because without it, you're going to get very little hypertrophy from other effects. But what the interplay is, and could there be other factors? Hypoxia is thought to be a potential mechanistic factor. Cell swelling is another one that has been theorized to be involved. So,
yeah, no, look, I can see why you're so fascinated by this, as am I, and I think this topic that has obviously dominated much of your time, but is acted out by trillions of people potentially, billions of people in gyms on a daily basis who are on the belief that what they're doing is what they should be doing, more or less, train, say, 3 times a week, lift a bit. Females even get worried about this stuff, whether or not lifting heavy is going to give them big muscles, because they may not necessarily feel that they want to get big muscles, as if it was that easy. All the way through to, as I said, the nutritional interventions that we can get into, the role of, calorie surpluses or calorie deficits, and protein quantities, quality of protein, and leucine thresholds and all that stuff, which we can, if we have time, maybe delve back into it. But on the stuff that we do know, or at least you have high levels of confidence in, how a muscle works, of which there is a fair amount of information in terms of how mechanically it's working, I guess. What are those important concepts that go into the stimulation or the usage of that muscle, that machine, to bring about adaptations that are going to result in things like size, strength, power, but particularly hypertrophy, since that's our main area of interest here?
Yeah, so I think I understand the question. If not, you can rephrase.
Please do. Yeah.
But yeah, so when you impose a force on a muscle, so let's say which generally is done through a resistance, let's say lifting weights. So let's say you're doing a biceps curl. The muscle fibers sense a sense of force, a mechanical stimuli. That mechanical stimuli is then converted at the extracellular matrix level and down from there into chemical forces, which then go through various pathways or enzymatic pathways that then lead to protein synthesis. So that's a very simplified response, but the complex network of pathways, we have multiple pathways that have been identified. So there's a nodal point called mTOR, the mechanistic. I don't want to get too much into the geeky aspect of it, but anyway, this mTOR pathway is a nodal point, which many different pathways, somewhat downstream, which many pathways end up going to carry out protein synthesis. But there are mTOR independent pathways as well. And again, stop me if I'm getting too, I can start to
Please
geek out on
I'm loving
this.
it. Keep going.
But there are mTOR independent pathways that also can be involved. We know when we knock out mTOR, which is a primary enzyme, that you're going to blunt substantial hypertrophy, but you don't completely obliterate it. So there can be hypertrophy that is realized even in the absence of activating mTOR. And thus this whole network of enzymes ultimately functions to carry out protein synthesis. So that's why mechanotransduction, which is the mechanical forces and why mechanical stress is so important, initiates this. But again, other stimuli and sensors can activate the enzymes, certain enzymes within these pathways conceivably. And there's other factors that are involved as well. So the efficiency of your ribosomes are where protein translation is carried out. Somewhat the quantity, there's some controversy or it's equivocal whether the quantity versus the efficiency of these ribosomes really are, which one's more important. I think some of the more recent research points to the efficiency, how efficient the ribosomes are at producing these proteins, which, by the way, can be enhanced through resistance training itself. Satellite cells are clearly involved in the process. So satellite cells are muscle stem cells, which not only donate nuclei, they can increase the number of nuclei, which, of course, then can increase protein transcription, the ability for proteins to be transcribed for translation. And then, of course, there's other factors as well. So there's the extracellular matrix itself has various communicative aspects with the muscle cell and with the enzymes within it. And it's thought, people talk about muscle damage, but there is at least a theory that damage to the extracellular matrix and its remodeling causes this communication within the muscle fiber or muscle fibers to initiate hypertrophic responses. So these are things that, again, are, in my humble opinion, from my reading of the literature, still very poorly characterized, that we still have a lot to learn. We know a ton more than we did 10, 15, 20 years ago, and we're going to learn much more over the coming 10, 15, 20 years.
So in terms of mechanisms, what's the more recent aspects of mechanistic research related to muscle hypertrophy that you've seen that's been most exciting to you?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is contradictory. So there's been some research on lactate, where lactate has been shown to be a stimuli, hypertrophic stimuli in certain rodent studies, and then in certain human studies, it's shown not to have effects. But you have to look at the way the studies are being carried out and your ability to draw causality. So like one of the human studies, they actually injected lactate into the bloodstream, which is not necessarily the same as if you're getting intramuscular stimulation with lactate buildup. So again, we can look at studies. What is your ability to actually draw causality, and what are the limitations of these studies? So mechanisms are extremely hard to determine, because when you alter one mechanism, generally you're going to affect other mechanisms or potential mechanisms. So then you're trying to tease out which one is really responsible for this. I mentioned earlier that I think one of the real interesting ones has been with ribosomes. So ribosomes, again, are where protein translation takes place. And there's been some recent evidence showing that the efficiency by which translation occurs within the ribosome is more important than adding more the capacity to add more ribosomes. I think the evidence is moderate there. We need certainly not, I wouldn't say strongly compelling, but I think it's interesting. And there's so many other areas. Well, actually, one of the other things that's been really interesting to me is the discovery of so many different metabolites that are produced during training. So, often going back to when I was writing my paper and doing my master's work, there was a very limited number of metabolites that were discussed: your lactate, your hydrogen ions, and a few others. And there's dozens of metabolites that have been identified that are involved in the not necessarily the hypertrophic response, but the response to resistance training, which at least produces the hypothesis that they may be involved.
So when you talk about things like exercise-induced muscle growth, we're thinking, okay, well, look, a common denominator there is some kind of training stimulus, some form of exercise is required, right? So we can come back to some of those things in a minute. But the area that I'm particularly interested in, given I'm a nutritionist, and things like lifestyle, maybe even topics like sleep or recovery or whatever, also can be important to this. If we get the training stimulus right, and we agree there's different ways of approaching it from a training perspective, what are the critical lifestyle components, to include nutrition, of course, that are going to play the biggest roles? They're going to be the sort of the biggest levers to pull on this process of achieving hypertrophy.
Yeah, certainly you mentioned nutrition is a huge component. Now, your resistance training is the king of hypertrophy. You can eat a lot, and eating in itself is anabolic, particularly certainly when you include protein, have sufficient protein in there. If you're going to be in a caloric surplus, you will gain weight and you will gain some muscle along with that. But the majority, if you're not resistance training, of that weight gain will be in the form of fat. Whereas if you then add resistance training into it, you can reverse that and have the majority gain from muscle. But protein, the quantity of protein, having sufficient protein, so achieving a critical threshold of protein intake is really important. Being in a caloric surplus is important for maximizing the response. And again, we can get into this more. To some extent, the types of fats there's some evidence that certain types of fats, particularly omega-3 fats, have signaling effects. They create greater fluidity in the outside of the cell, in the cellular membrane, and thus allow for greater transmission of signaling, creating that intracellular cascade that I mentioned. Rest is going to be really important. So there's critical amounts of sleep that I think need to be achieved, but there's not a critical. People try to say you need 7 to 8 hours of sleep, and there's very little evidence that that's the case. I think those are general guidelines, but there's an individual component to it, and people can subsist on more or less. I think it's pretty safe to say that if someone's just sleeping 1 to 2 hours, they're going to be compromising their rejuvenative capacity. But if they're getting 5 hours sleep versus 7, we don't have any clear evidence that. I think that would be somewhat individual based on other factors, and job lifestyle will enter into that. Stress is going to be a factor as well. Again, not a lot of empirical evidence, but heavy amounts of mental stress, distress. So there's a difference between eustress, which is quote unquote good stress, and distress. But if you're under a lot of distress, which would produce catabolic hormones, particularly cortisol, we're not clear on the effects of that, but certainly I think there's at least a good logical rationale. So yeah, many lifestyle factors. You have to look at the difference between lifestyle factors and your imposed factors.
And I know you're a huge fan of, saying it depends. Historically, I've always been banging on about context and these sorts of things. And of course, it is important. And that does require a lot of understanding of the individual needs and preferences of the individual. There's all sorts of things there. And then yet it's still with an understanding that despite all of these things, at least there's some training stimulus. You're probably still going to get some sort of an effect. But the one area that I find particularly interesting in this regard is, particularly as a nutritionist, you're either working with people who want to lose weight, and by that, they are thinking high quality weight loss, i.e., fat loss without the loss of muscle, and or I'm working with functional minded individuals who are athletes, so they still need to perform. So they are looking for body composition changes, but ultimately it's all about strength, speed, and power. But in both scenarios, particularly with athletes with a high training and competition schedule, and all those engaging in diets or, even bodybuilders, of course, looking to make weight, they're going to find themselves in an energy deficit. And that is an area that's quite interesting. What are your thoughts about energy deficits and its impact on hypertrophy? And are there any ways to mitigate that?
Yeah, so if you are in an energy deficit, you will not maximize your muscular gains. If you want to maximize hypertrophy, you're going to need to be in some sort of caloric surplus, probably somewhere between 300 to 500 calories. I'm in favor, in general, of having a clean bulk, if you will, so where you're minimizing fat gain. But when you're doing that, you will generally get some fat gain, especially if you're more advanced. Now, if you're a newbie to training, you can actually handle higher surpluses and gain very little fat. But for those who are experienced with resistance training, even at, let's say, a 500 calorie deficit, you're probably looking at, and there was actually just a recent study on this, somewhere between 2/3 to 3/4% muscle gain versus 1/3 to 25% fat gain. When you're in a deficit, you can actually recomp. So we see this all the time in research. There's two primary factors that are involved in that. Number one, how lean you are to start. So the more body fat you have, the easier it is to recomp, to gain muscle while you are losing fat, conceivably because the body has energy reserves within it, in its fat tissue, to support the muscle building process. And number two is how experienced you are in resistance training. So the more of a newbie you are, if you're just starting out, it's much easier to gain muscle while losing fat. So on the other side of that coin, those who are lean and those who are very well experienced in resistance training have much more difficulty, in the amount of muscle they can gain in a deficit becomes more and more compromised. The other 600-pound gorilla in the room is, of course, steroid use. If you're taking anabolics, pharmacological aids, you can certainly gain muscle while losing fat. So to your point, you still can maintain the vast majority of your muscle while losing fat, even at pretty lean, when you're pretty lean and experienced, assuming you are resistance training adequately, until you get below about 10% body fat. So we've done case studies on this in bodybuilders where they maintain the majority of their lean tissue. But once they start getting into that single digit and lower single digit, they will start to leach muscle. Basically, the body doesn't have sufficient energy stores to support the maintenance, and at that point, you will lose muscle. So if you're at 8%, 7%, 6% body fat, which for bodybuilders is what you generally need to be, you will be losing a good deal of muscle in the process.
And Brad, what's the relevance of, well, there's two areas that I want to mention, but I'll come up with them at the same time. One of which is sort of young muscle and old muscle. And the other one is males and females, because a lot of this research is done on young males, isn't it? So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, in what context?
Well, in factors that may, different, are there any differences between young and old, and also male or female, that we know of that's worth noting here as it comes to achieving maximal or optimal hypertrophy?
Young and old is quite easy. So there is a insensitivity, anabolic insensitivity that tends to occur as you get older. So look, it is mitigated if you start training if you've been training since you were young, like myself, as I'm getting older, you're going to maintain a lot of what you have. And certainly you're going to be able even to gain some muscle. But you're still going to be at a diminished capacity for muscle building when you're 50 compared to when you're 20. I mean, there's hormonal factors. So your generally testosterone production is going to start to diminish as you get older, and other hormonal factors. Your recovery is not what it was when you were younger. You're just not going to be able to handle the volume and the frequency of training. This has been well documented, and the capacity to build muscle, the ability to have muscles sensitive to leucine, to protein stimuli is diminished. Now, but with that said, you can still build, particularly for those who are novel, new to resistance training. We've done meta-analyses on the oldest of the old, 75 years and older, and they've gained 20%, 15, 20% muscle cross-sectional area in 8 to 10 weeks with a regimented program. Now, male-female is somewhat interesting. There's not much difference in muscle building on a relative basis. So certainly women have diminished capacity they're not going to be as big. I'm not breaking any new ground here, is that you look at a male bodybuilder versus a female bodybuilder, the overall size. But in the rate of growth will be somewhat similar between men and women. Women seem to be able to handle, have less issues with higher frequencies, and also the time, let's say in between sets, they're able to have greater recovery. So the frequency between sessions and also intra-session seems to be somewhat greater. It's not clear why. Perhaps there's some theories hormonally that estrogen may be involved. There's other theories that women aren't training with as heavy loads, so the ability to recover is better because the loads are lighter. But generally, there's not much difference in the rate of growth. So let's say a man at 50 millimeters of muscle thickness, if that person gains 5 millimeters, that's a 10% gain. Women who are, let's say, at 25 millimeters for the same muscle gain 2.5, and they're also, that would be 10%. I'm sorry, 10%, right? A 10% gain. So on a relative basis, it's the same, but men are gaining more on an absolute basis in general.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. And, we're talking about, biology here, but the biological relevance of being male or female, and young and old. But what's exciting, though, is that people without your level of knowledge can go into a gym equipped with relatively small amounts of knowledge, and they'll achieve something just by exercising. Now, obviously, it's very nuanced. There's better ways of training. There's absolutely terrible ways of training. But ultimately, keeping it simple, exercise is better than not doing exercise, right?
Yeah. So first of all, I always say, and this is so important, that a lot of my followers are just muscle geeks or bodybuilders, et cetera. The vast majority of people can see quite appreciable gains from simple minimalistic routines. If you train 1 to 1.5 hours a week, 2 to 3 days a week, let's say a half-hour session, doing single sets of your major muscle groups, 5, 6 major muscle exercises, multi-joint movements, you can achieve a majority of your muscle and strength gains, or a lot of it. So again, depending on your goal for a majority of the population, that would be sufficient for their gains. And certainly from the health perspective, would be a majority of the health effects. So it's only when you want to really take your body to that next level to achieve your ultimate physique, if you will, where that becomes important. Now, to your question, I think that if your goal is to take your physique to the next level, it becomes critically important to have that understanding of what the things we're talking about and more of the science, because evidence-based practice is understanding the science, but then having the practical expertise, being involved in your experience to take that science and making yourself an N=1 experiment. When I first started training, I was a bro. I followed the bodybuilding magazines. I'll date myself, but they were still delivering them in the mail, like Flex Magazine, Muscle and Fitness. You probably
Me too, Brad.
were still around then. So I'd rip off the cover and I'd follow my favorite bodybuilder's routine, and I got gains from it. But I then plateaued fairly readily, and that kind of set my journey in motion to say, hey, this can't be it. Why are those bodybuilders looking like they are? And I was somewhat naive and didn't realize it wasn't just creatine they were taking. Well, I kind of knew that, but also I didn't really have a full appreciation, or certain, not even close to an appreciation for other factors that were involved. So yeah, when you want to start, the closer you want to get to optimization of your genetic potential, the more important having a scientific approach becomes.
Yeah, well, that's why I'm talking to you and have all the other guests that I have on this podcast. So, I mean, the audience is primarily people who are pretty seriously into their training and or work with athletes or whatnot. But look, I know we've only got a few minutes left of your valuable time. Maybe you could just summarize then the research findings on the optimal sort of protocols for maximizing muscle growth, just as a sort of a way of ending this conversation.
Yeah, so I can only, of course, give general guidelines. So ultimately, the guidelines need to be taken in context with individual genetics, lifestyle, et cetera, as I just mentioned. That is evidence-based practice, which is the transition of, or the translating science into practice. So yeah, first, volume is a primary driver of hypertrophy. There's been multiple studies now. I mean, I think the research is now quite compelling that up to a certain point, there's a dose-response relationship. Current general guidelines is somewhere around 10 to somewhere around 20 sets can be optimal for a given muscle group. But there's a lot of nuances. First of all, some people do better on somewhat lower volumes than that. And there's nothing that says that volume needs to be the same for every muscle group. There's there's working theories that you can only perform a certain amount of volume with your total training program, and thus you need to structure your volume for muscles that are lagging versus more well-developed and manage your volume that way. You also don't necessarily have to do the same total volume across a given training cycle. So you can periodize volume from over certain periods of time, going from a lower to a moderate to a higher, and then having recovery intervals and dating back. So again, a very involved process for those who want to maximize hypertrophy, for those who just want to get some gains. Like I said, minimalistic programs work. Loading is something that's been really one of my hobby horses and really interesting to me in that you can gain muscle. This is now quite compelling. One of the more compelling areas of research has shown that across a very wide spectrum of loading ranges, somewhere between 5 reps up to 30 plus reps, you can get very similar whole muscle hypertrophy, provided that you are taking sets close to failure. Now, there seems to be a threshold if you're going to do 80 reps or, at some certain point, there's going to be diminished returns, perhaps through boredom that you're just not getting sufficiently taxing the muscle. But yeah, you can achieve sufficient whole muscle hypertrophy or similar. Now, there's still some questions in my mind as to whether there may be differences in fiber type hypertrophy. There's some evidence that your somewhat heavier loading can be more conducive to type 2 fiber hypertrophy and type 1 fiber hypertrophy to somewhat lighter loading. I think that still needs a lot of work before we get better ideas on that. By the way, some of our research has refuted that hypothesis, but I don't think it's compelling one way or the other. One of the most important things is proximity to failure. So if you're not training with a high intensity of effort, you're not going to make gains. Or certainly once you get beyond a newbie stage, you're not. But how close to failure do you have to go? I was a bro, like when I was coming up, every set had to be to failure with drop sets and then forced reps after that, and maybe integrating some accentuated eccentric overload, on top of that. But the evidence is becoming, I think, pretty compelling that stopping somewhere around 2 to 3 reps short of failure, depending on your rep range, can be just as effective or similarly effective to going to failure. And I'm still not sure that having some failure training may not be beneficial, again, to achieve your ultimate hypertrophy. Maybe that's just my personal bias as a former bro, still wanting to believe that. But certainly I think the evidence is becoming compelling that the majority of your training can be somewhat further away from failure. But it has to still be high. You have to train with a quite high intensity of effort. Then other things like frequency, Probably a minimum of 3 days a week is needed to get enough volume in, but probably more 4 days a week and perhaps more depending on the volume you have, because you don't want to have very long training sessions. You don't want to be doing 2-hour, 3-hour training sessions because the quality of your training diminishes. Rest intervals, another area. Somewhat, we have a meta-analysis that will be coming out shortly, so you'll get a scoop here, but very short rest intervals seem to be suboptimal, so 1 minute or less, but above 90 seconds and above, there's certainly not data to show that longer rest intervals are superior versus shorter in that context. We do know that having a mix of different exercises that focus on different areas, if your goal is bodybuilding, where you're looking to develop your physique fully, you need to be able to work all the different aspects of a muscle, which requires a multi-exercise approach. So that's kind of a general guideline. And I'd also end by saying that the evidence on periodization is poor. We just don't have good studies on it. In my humble opinion, the quality of those studies is just not good for drawing causality. But I think logically there's a basis. For me, periodization is just about planning. And if you're not, there's an old Chinese axiom that says, those who fail to plan to fail. And if you don't have a plan to get to where you want to go, you're probably not going to achieve your optimal results. So having some type of plan, if you want to call it periodization, if you just want to call it systematic planning, I think that is certainly an important factor that's just the logical, has a logical basis to it.
Yeah, I like the idea of the 5 Ps, as in prior preparation prevents poor performance. There's a slightly more explicit version of that, but it's true. Anyway, thank you so much, Brad, Professor Schoenfeld, for joining me on Fueling Greatness. It's been invaluable information that you've shared, and down the line, it would be great to catch up with you again and see what more you've learned from your research when there's more to talk about this stuff.
Always my pleasure, Laurent, and I have total respect for you as a colleague and a fellow researcher. So thank you for having me.
Well, that's very kind of you. Thank you so much. It means a lot. Thank you, and take care, and I'll talk to you again soon.
Ciao.